Maybe the most important thing is I know Al Cross, which seems to be one of the most important parts of today's presentation. Abby gave a tremendous discussion about light and all of the forms that it can do, especially in what winds up being the concert venue, the black box. And in those environments, the light can be such an animating tool. As we met for the first time a week ago, we thought the counterpoint of perhaps two variations on any discussion of lighting and storytelling, lighting can oftentimes be a big part of storytelling, is that what happens if the light is in the room? And to some degree, as we've talked about already, the room is the giver of the light. So in some way, light is architecture, architecture is light. I thought I could talk about, in some of the more specific ways, how the room can actually be perceived as the light and how the light can lend itself to the room more than the thought that the light is the piece of hardware that we work with. It is an interesting time to be in this industry. It's a wonderful proliferation of technology, but with new technology comes a lot of the issues of making it work for you. And there's a difference between being on the bleeding edge of starting something where what you've started is so cutting edge that you've hurt yourself, versus leading the charge to a new way of seeing. One of the things, since I could stand here and wave my arms, I'm not going to describe the light in an animation of waving my arms. I think if we have something in common that we can refer to, Abby touched on it a little bit, what do we bring to the discussion so that we can actually form an opinion together about the story that we want to tell? If we have something in common, if we have things that we can talk about together, I'd like to think they're inspirations. Here is something that perhaps is almost a universal sense. There are artists who have studied. Monet has taken perhaps the object again and again and again and tried to understand it in its different iterations. The argument is, if it's the same object and it changes in the light, that's a beginning discussion of how we think of the room that we're in, the space that we want to form. The light is the giver of the form. You've seen the Pantheon. One of the questions that's always wonderful if you get to stand in that space is to try to understand, what is the light? Where is the light in this room? Is it the sun that hits the dome? Is it the aperture that lets the light into the room? Or is it actually the room with, and I never know in the modern age how someone could have worked this before, is it actually this wonderful sense of being in a room where a combination of light marble and dark marble, some trompe-l'oeil in certain bands, but the idea is that essentially, if you look at the room carefully, it's a perfect pinhole camera before photography was ever invented. Most of the light comes from the sky that you never see, and in that pinhole, the entire environment that you've made comes from something that is no longer about the hole in the ceiling, but the room reflecting what it's brought into it. Those inspirations lead to the modern day. Surely James Turrell understands space. What's the light fixture? Is the installation a square hole to the sky? I'd like to argue that it's the combination of the sky and the room. And if the light is the architecture that informs the room, we can start talking about what it is that's important to try and tell the story. It isn't about the hardware we use, it's about what we're informing. Sometimes there can even be the melding of where does the light begin and where does the light end. And from that inspiration, you can apply it directly to trying to tell a story about something that has nothing to do with art, but gives you an environment that lets something, whether it's a person in a room or an exhibit in an aquarium, a field to let the room become the light source. Where's the light source in this room? Is it the window? Is it the light bouncing off the floor? You start to play with materials, and when you start to work in a themed environment or architecture, and you start worrying about what the sense of the room is, the place that maybe you can start having the dialogue of what it is that you want to see, whether it's the pre-show or it's the experience that you're going to go through. One of the most important parts of this room as a light fixture is a kind of marble called Tennessee pink. There's a lot of architecture from this time that takes this wonderful floor. It's not polished, it's not white marble, it's in different variations, gray to pink, but it's honed and it's soft like butter, and the light comes into the room and it sends it everywhere else. So is the window the light fixture? Is it the sun's rays? Well, the sun's rays have to be informed by the dust, and in a time that this building was built, since it's been built, there have been buildings that have obliterated these windows. You'll never see this view again. You'll see it in the early mornings coming in from the east, but you'll never get to see this again. And the other thing that you won't get to see, even if the building was there to some degree, is that there was a time that this would have been ornamented with spittoons and cigar smokers, and the atmosphere that was created in a different era of horses and dust and cigars would probably never give you this same effect today. In that regard, the room is the light source, because once the light enters the room, it has to finish filling the void that the light began. From the inspiration of architecture, those same inspirations then take us into the themed environment of theater. You've seen what they can do in the aquarium environment. One inspiration leads to the other, and if there's going to be a collaboration of a lighting designer who's going to wave his hands, there has to be something that we have in common. And that's why I think these inspirations let us begin a process. And that's a little bit what I'd like to talk about today. The process of coming to a decision is one of the hardest things to do and one of the richest pieces of a collaboration. How can we work together in the abstract to get to a conclusion at the end of something? If we have something in common together, then we can have these conversations to build what winds up being the story we want to tell together, through script, through visuals, through objects, and with light to support that. It was really interesting this morning to understand that as we're trying to engage our audiences more and more, there is a sense that maybe we want to see each other more and more. So the sense of a room needs to be and wants to be something where people can not just be isolated and be told where to look, but perhaps can look at each other while they're looking in the room. There are many art installations that have done that. You come into what is essentially an empty room, but you're in a room of people. And at some point, the people animate the room. So just like the question would be, what's the light fixture? There's even a question of what is the art. You're not going to be in this room by yourself. With all of that, and with all of the technology that we can do, the inspiration with the new technology has caused a few problems for me. And I think a few problems for people who want to tell a story. We have the ability now to digitize what light can be. Abby mentioned video and lighting can almost become the same thing. What is it that we're doing where if everything is special in the room, nothing is special? Having a point of view is important. More than the fact that I can do everything, what is it that I want to do? And one of the things that makes that consternation so difficult, and I thought I should define it to try and help us all work through this a little bit, is if there's a sudden amazement, if there's a dread that results in utter confusion, I think that's a very good definition of a lot of bad digital lighting that you see. There's a lot of technology that's getting embraced industrially, but I will never understand how looking out the window flying over the Alps a few weeks ago can be translated into this mishigash of LED creativity on the Airbus and Boeing new series of psychobabble, where you're supposed to think that sitting in your chair in a plastic ceiling is going to make you think that you're going to be compliant, or if you're a penguin, breed. It even gets into the sense that they think that if you're going to sit in a conference room or if you're going to work in an architect's office all day long and we change the light in the ceiling so that it's a little pink in the morning and a little brighter in the day and a little bluer at night, we'll all be better workers. I can guarantee you I've never sat in an environmental conference room and felt better for doing it, regardless of the color of the ceiling. But within my industry, there are those who think that, oh, we'll change the color. We'll just, if we don't have a good enough idea, we'll just keep moving things around because we can. And I'd like to think that what we should be able to be is, with all the technology available, we should be able to become better editors. The word designer is an interesting word because my mentor was a brilliant person who never thought that the word designer should be applied to lighting. He thinks that we're editors. If a script is if a book and a script is always done and improved by its editor, I've always thought it was interesting when people will thank their editors as they have a very successful book. I'd like to think that in any story we're going to tell, and lighting being a part of that story, is not what we bring to the table about what we can add, but what we can do to edit the story down, to keep the story clean, simple in a way that makes the clarity let the audience or the person in the room know what it is that you want to see. So we'll look at 3 realizations where lighting editing, with all of the choices available, let the light either inform the architecture or in some ways the architecture become the light. One's an exhibit, the Space Shuttle Atlantis. Here's an object massive in scale, known for flying in space, and yet the design problem is we want to come and see something that is going to be a static object. My firm also did at the Smithsonian Museum, the Hazy Center, which has out by Dulles Airport a large collection of airplanes. Something that by definition is dynamic and known for flight is something that is going to be sitting in a room that you're going to be in for a long, long time. So the whole notion here is that we wanted to create a moment to reveal the shuttle. I've always thought that first impressions were the best impressions. That's why I dressed up today. And I think it's the same in exhibits. I think that your first initial contact with what it is that you want to tell the story about is the one that you'll probably take away. We met at the offices of the exhibit architects and the designers, and it was clear that there was a long process to come to the shuttle. One of the design premises here is that you don't just show up, open the door, and see the shuttle. There's a long experiential, because of the crowds that were anticipated, there's a process to come in and finally arrive at the shuttle, what we'd call a wow moment. What we're looking at is a white model space. I don't think it's 1 inch, but it might be, of the shuttle, and in front of it is actually the theater where people would have seen an introduction before they would see the shuttle. And when we were brought onto the team, the whole concept was you would learn about the space program, you would learn about what's happened, you would learn where we were to the moment that you would finally get to see it. And after an absolutely incredible video narrative, you are going to be able to come through, literally come through the projection screen and see the shuttle for the first time. Right up, nose to your nose. That's why you had this 45-minute ascension where, with the lines in the crowds, you were actually adapted by coming inside from the Florida sun, making your way up, coming into a darkened space, and then getting revealed to the orbiter for the first time. If you're going to spend that much time and you're going to invest that much work into delaying the whole reason you've come to see it for the first time, that first moment needed to be important. This is the view that you would see if you were inside the video theater before you came out. Looking at that and understanding that behind the shuttle there was actually a large video array, my first thought was, well, what's the light source going to be in the room? You're in a darkened theater, you're looking at a video, the screen comes up and you see the shuttle. that seemed like a terrible break between being in one space and being into another. So we looked at it and we realized that although we can't make the shuttle move, we could make the light move across the shuttle. And with the idea that we had a video behind, we could try to let the orbiter be the light fixture in the room when you saw it for the first time. Some sense of kineticism, some sense of movement, and for your first view of her up close, when you never knew how you would see her for the first time, we thought that was the moment we should capitalize on. So here's the model that we did with some video in the background, and we realized that our first thoughts were the right thoughts, that actually the white sense of the orbiter was the light fixture in the room, and we used the orbiter as the light palette within the black box to let us define the movement and the shape of what it is people would see for the first time. The inspiration for that really came from the fact that at first it was going to be a movie, and then the movie would end, the door would open, and you would see the orbiter for the first time. We thought, what if we used the gauze? What if we used the theatrical metaphor of the scrim, so that there would be a reveal, but the reveal would actually come out of the video instead of one simply leading to the other. So we did a little mock-up. What we tried to bring to the table as the lighting designers was the scrim idea. Instead of saying it's a projection screen, we said, let's make a perforated projection screen. We'll let the video end, and we'll start to reveal what happens as the scrim flies away and as the video plays. There's a wonderful moment in space that the astronauts call, it's the blue moment that comes just before sunrise. It's the indigo glow. Space is black, but for us and for what we want to do, there is a magic moment where the sky gets to be this incredible indigo before it becomes incredibly amber, before it just becomes a very bright light into the cab of the shuttle. And so by bringing through these different iterations, we thought the wow moment, which is some 7 to 12 seconds, could actually inform you for the rest of your experience when you got to learn more about her. Watch what happens in this video. In this video, this is the end of what you were seeing in the orientation theater. As it comes through and waiting 45 minutes to see what you had come for all day to see, we were hoping that exactly what would happen is after all of the time of looking at flat, at two-dimensional, at video, suddenly the object was larger than life. And by doing that, taking the inspiration of the scrim, taking the inspiration of the room as being a veil that you can walk through, we think that that process was what we could bring to the table as the collaborators with the lighting moment of telling the story and getting to the wow moment. Once you're there, there are moments as we have to reset because every 10 minutes people will come into the event. We would go back and forth in the blue. And this is one of the things, again, in the consternation of what happens. What you're able to do now is change color and light so frequently. We all have brains, and the eye adaptation that we get to learn if we see color changing so much is after a while, we turn it off. We get used to it. There's a reason why in Coney Island and a lot of spook house rides, the ride starts outside and it's 3 to 5 minutes. You start outside in the bright sun, you slam through the doors, you're into the world of the old fluorescent blacklight tubes, and after a certain amount of time, the magic goes away. And then you come back out into the sunlight again. With all of the technology that we still have the human condition that lets us realize that as we go from one scene to the other scene to the next scene and the next, after enough time, we simply tire of it. If that first implementation is the one that we see and we like, that lets us perhaps remember, because as we go back and forth from one sense of color to the next, which is what we've done to set up for the next group of people coming through that scrim, it was that first time they saw it. And what we've learned is that every time coming through after that, it was no longer a distraction because they could then focus on what they wanted to see in the details. From an exhibit to a museum, Old Man Barnes, a very wealthy Philadelphian, had a different way of trying to see what a museum would be. He took a collection, a private collection, and became one of the preeminent originators of, especially in America, Impressionism and modern art. He would marry African sculpture with French Impressionists, and he built in a suburb of Detroit, a very affluent suburb of Philadelphia, his own private, almost by invitation, museum where he could present his own way of looking at things. When he died, he wanted his museum to stay exactly the way it was left, which turned into a lawsuit. The institution that kept his collection was losing money and wanted to move it. And it became a litigious problem in that to move it, the collection had to stay the same. Ironically, one of the things that the judge decided in the case and allowed was, in saying that the collection could move to be where it could be seen by more people, he wondered if we could do something about the lighting at the same time. So the award-winning architects took the idea on your left of a gallery in a garden and actually turned it into garden settings within a gallery. He wanted to take the same arrangement, but he wanted to try to make the rooms have a little more purpose within them. This is actually what happens more in downtown Philadelphia. The gray square is the original building, and it's surrounded more in a park-like environment. But in that park-like environment, what we were looking at was, in the collection itself, even if the collection had to stay the same, if there were lighting challenges to what had been World War I 1920s lighting, which were large open windows and a single light fixture in the middle, how could we take all of this color and breathe life back into it? How could we breathe life into the collection without changing how the collection actually sat in the room? We started with the architect looking for inspiration. We wanted to make a room of light. We wanted to let the light be the architecture of the room. And going back to our inspirations, we go back to our old friend, Mr. Turrell, who absolutely understands that within a space, where's the light fixture in the room? Well, at some moment, the room is the light source. And if you have the room as the light source, you can reimagine the collection by letting the room inform the pictures instead of saying that you have to light the pictures. I spent a lot of time as a museum designer, some 13 years, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And one of the things that I learned, although I came late to the party, from the golden age, the first age of special exhibits, what we called the King Tut era, where they were black rooms with pin spots everywhere, that's when I first started hearing the problem that the audience was tired. At the end of a long experience of black rooms and just looking at everything as being pin spotted, if everything was special, nothing was special. And the people in the room were actually taken out of the experience. So what has actually come about in the museum experience is that the room is the vessel that tells the story. And within telling the story, people will look at each other. In the bad old days of the mid-'70s in New York City, museums were places, as much as you could try to look at a picture, it was a place that you could find a date. It was a place that you could actually come and be safe, and it became a destination for more than just seeing if there was a Van Gogh this week or to see what special event was playing. It was a destination, and what we've learned is that the room, in many ways, is the vessel of what it is that you're trying to present. And if people understand and feel comfortable in the room, they'll stay and they'll be drawn to not only the place as a destination, but also the exhibit that you want them to see. So we did have to play a lot without changing the collection. We did use, as you've heard Tim mention, clear story architecture. If we put small windows in the top of a room, and if we actually use the architecture at the same time, I'll ask it again, what's the light fixture? We studied very carefully. We didn't want the light fixture to be the biggest object in the room, so we would shape the room. We would shape the experience of the vessel so that the light fell where you wanted it to be. And in that regard, the windows that used to be the primary lighting of the museum became less important, and they became the texture of the room, so that all of that polychrome that you got to see in the paintings was easier to see without changing what it had been for so many decades before. And in some ways, if light is architecture, sometimes if architecture is light, it starts blurring the lines between who does what. The original scheme, the original design in the 1920s were lit by simple fixtures in the room. When we were able to take the rooms and reimagine them, we used what was the thought of the light fixture as the placebo that tried to let your eye stay lower into the room. If you take your thumb and you put it over that light fixture, you see that suddenly the biggest object in the room is the ceiling. Having an object in the room, and in this case being a light fixture, was actually the device that tried to let us use the space up above and yet not draw your eye too far away, so that you could keep your horizon down where the paintings would be. That even came then as the mission of the museum was to try and breathe life and breed new financial worth in the front of the museum, what became the all-important general space. Even the ceiling in the public space was an important part that would say, when you were outside and you were led into the museum, a level of expectation about the kind of space you would come in. The lantern then even worked outside, because as we're trying to bring people in to revive what had been a standalone collection that now needed money, the light became a beacon to try and bring people in from the outside. So from exhibit to museum to memorial, memorials are somewhat different in that perhaps they are more singular purposed, and we were honored to be part of the September 11th memorial, where from the rubble that happened on September 11th, there is a vision of taking what had been the footprints of the building and imagining them into being places of refuge, places that you could come, and places that would be an environment to let everyone share a shared experience. And in future generations, not only a shared experience, but a destination that was worthy of the destination. The concept was that the voids that were the footprint of the World Trade Centers would now be sparkling fountains. But within those sparkling fountains, because they were depressed, in this case, the room is outside. The room is the park. And the park wanted to be an environment where you could see and be seen. We didn't want this to be dark and dramatic. We wanted it to be easy to come to at night, and yet solitary. So the inspirations for the water became shimmering light. And by starting from the reference of shimmering light, we could actually take away from what was the gravity of what the memorial was for to make it something not only enlightening, but something that in future generations who may not know the exact experience could appreciate the beauty that came out of the tragedy. This takes a lot of understanding. Waving our arms and having photographs doesn't work. So there's a lot of work in understanding how the light works with the water, and ultimately, by putting the light behind the water and using the new technology that I was damning so much in the earlier Consternation phase, we were able to find a way that we could make a light source, and in the 10 years it took us to actually construct these fountains, the light fixture that we put in had not been possible when we started the process. We had the element of time, we had the element of collaboration, and we had the inspiration to all work on something over what was almost literally a 10-year process to get to what we could all agree from the inspiration in the beginning. And so what we get is we get glittering inspiration, which from the first meetings when we thought what we wanted to do together, the collaboration let us know at the end that this is what we all had wanted from the first. in addition to that, the names of all of the victims from Pennsylvania, from Washington, and from New York are all lining the fountains. These wanted to be tactile. These didn't want to just be light boxes. They're shadows in the day, and they're voids at night, that we find that people do rubbings, people put flowers, people put notes in the wall, almost a wailing wall of New York City. That meant that as a negative space, we used the light. We used actually the device itself as the lantern that the light came through the words. And like all mock-ups, it took a lot of experimentation to do. But together, they made an environment that at night was restful, it was reverential, and yet at the same time, it was inspirational and sparkling. The irony of all of this is that within trying to understand architecture as light and light as architecture, during the construction, which has only recently opened, of the 9/11 museum down at Bedrock at the foundations of the original World Trade Center and the fountains that opened a few years ago, our firm also did something known as the tribute in light. Shortly after the towers fell, there was an immediate need to use some way of saying that we are still here, some way of remembering, even while we were clearing away the rubble, a sense of who we are and why we are still there. And there is a large consortium, this whole idea of inspiration. There was an almost universal quest that started to New York City, to the Arts Council, artists, architects, and Paul Marantz, the founding partner of our firm, to take the notion of the Twin Towers and make them some kind of metaphor of light. Do it now. Make it something that while we're rebuilding, it's something that we can appreciate and is worth it. This is actually an inspiration from 1945, coming out of a terrible tragedy in Los Angeles, taking what had been instruments of national defense, searchlights, and creating beacons of light in the sky. But the beacons of light in the sky are abstract, and what we wanted to remember is what we had lost. With the collaboration and on the pencil sketch, as all good ideas begin, no one could even agree how to make form to the light. And in finally understanding that it was Twin Towers that we needed to do, we needed to see if this would work, because this was going to be seen for the first time just a year after the tragedy in New York City. There was no dress rehearsal we could do. But we did know a show was coming down in Vegas, and we went out and we did an experiment in the desert in Vegas where we could work in relative obscurity to find out how to establish the relationship of light to architecture. And in this diagram, what we actually found is that what people would understand in light is the context of where the light was in the city. What's imposed in this diagram in the top right corner is the thin line is the actual World Trade Center footprints, 200 feet square, with the 50-foot square imprint of what would become the tribute in light. That the juxtaposition of two beams of light in the sense of the downtown cityscape was exactly the thing that was going to let you understand what we were trying to show. So we put these objects together, and in putting them together, we found that with all of the new technology we had, we couldn't quite find a way to do it. So we dispatched volunteers to Brooklyn, to New Jersey, and to Greenwich Village to help us see into the night. One of the things that was the most fun was my little contribution to the process was I had been working in Morocco, and I had always wanted to know how it was that you could make things straight in the middle of nature. And I saw a Moroccan electrician setting a street lighting pole, taking one of the oldest tricks in the book, what we know as a plumb bob, a weighted string, holding it from his thumb to let gravity tell him what is straight in the world. And so in very strange late night settings, we had teams of people with strings and washers helping us guide the light. And by golly, it worked. And with no dress rehearsal, we were able to, in the midst of the tragedy, give form and substance to something that we had lost. That process is shown here in a short video, which is just a time lapse of how you build light in air. You start with a corner, you build the other corners, and then you walk the walls in, taking the corners as reference points. This is as much a brick and mortar process of laying one foundation on the other as if it was concrete and steel. It takes time, but it takes collaboration and talent. And if the inspiration that we had started with was right, with no dress rehearsal, we were confident that we could give life to what we had lost. So we were able to create, in a funny twist, we were able to create architecture as light, when what I've been talking about before was light as architecture. And one of the great ironies of this particular monument is that the story we've told is not the story of the light, it's the story of New York City. This beam of light makes no sense unless it's in the context of the city that we're trying to say that we're still here. And the other irony of building architecture with light is that the World Trade Center was actually never floodlit, one of the few tall buildings in New York that wasn't. It was a silver surface that reflected the city that it saw. And with the lights inside, it was a lantern and a beacon. And now we've turned the tide where, although we have an exhibit in place, this is a powerful metaphor that now the victims' families in New York City has embraced, and what was going to be a temporary bridge to a permanent monument has become, in some ways, for one day, the New York City that we lost. Thank you.